The Iron Curtain descended across Europe on the 5th of March, 1946, not with the clang of metal, but with Winston Churchill's words in Fulton, Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, he declared. And with those words, the world split into two armed camps. But while men in Washington and Moscow drew maps and deployed missiles, a quieter, more insidious war was already being waged in the margins, in typing pools and research laboratories, at diplomatic receptions and university common rooms. This was where women would prove themselves not just useful to the intelligence apparatus, but essential. The Cold War would become the first conflict in history where female spies operated not as exotic anomalies, but as systematic assets. Their very ordinariness transformed into an operational advantage that neither the CIA, KGB, MI6, nor Stasi could afford to ignore. The architecture of Cold War espionage was built on mutual paranoia and competing ideologies. In 1947, the National Security Act created the CIA from the ashes of the wartime OSS, tasking it with gathering intelligence on the Soviet threat. Across the divide, the KGB, formally established in 1954, but growing from Stalin's earlier security apparatus, worked to penetrate Western governments, steal atomic secrets, and spread communist influence. East Germany's Stasi, founded in 1950, would become perhaps the most thorough surveillance state in history, eventually employing one informant for every 63 citizens. Britain's MI6, the oldest player, adapted its imperial tradecraft to this new bipolar world. Each service had learned from World War II that intelligence was as valuable as armies, perhaps more so. And each had learned something else: that women, so long dismissed as incapable of serious espionage work, had proven devastatingly effective when properly deployed. The reasons intelligence agencies turned to women were rooted in a paradox of sexism. In the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, women were simultaneously invisible and omnipresent in the spaces where secrets lived. They were the secretaries who typed classified documents, the researchers who handled sensitive materials, the wives and girlfriends who attended embassy parties where loose-lipped officials might be cultivated. We didn't see them as threats because we didn't see them at all, one former CIA officer admitted decades later. This blindness created opportunity. A woman at a typewriter could photograph documents between keystrokes. A woman at a social function could draw out confidences that a male operative could never access. The British XX Committee had discovered during World War II that female agents like Noor Inayat Khan could move through occupied territory with less suspicion than men. A woman traveling alone might be questioned, but a woman with the right cover story fit perfectly into the landscape of daily life. The recruitment process for female operatives varied by agency but shared common threads. The KGB famously employed what became known as swallow programs, training attractive women in persuasion and intimate manipulation to target foreign diplomats and officials. The Red Army's military intelligence school in Kazan, established in the 1,930 seconds, taught women not just tradecraft but psychology, languages, and what instructors euphemistically called special friendship techniques. Yet this romanticized approach was only one dimension of Soviet recruitment. Women like Melita Norwood were recruited on ideological grounds, their commitment to communist principles making them willing to betray their own countries for decades. Norwood, born in 1912 to a British mother and Latvian father, was drawn to communist ideals as a young woman in the 1,930 seconds. By 1937, working at the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association, she had access to atomic research and began passing documents to her Soviet handlers. Her motivation was belief, not blackmail or money. As she later explained, "I thought perhaps what I had access to might be useful in helping Russia to keep abreast of Britain, America, and Germany." The assumption that women were less ideologically serious than men meant that investigators often looked past them, even when evidence suggested otherwise. American recruitment took different forms. The CIA, constrained by 1,950 seconds American social norms, initially employed women primarily in analytical and support roles. Yet the agency quietly recognized that female officers could access targets that men could not. Julia Child, before she became famous for French cooking, worked for the OSS during World War II, and the CIA continued recruiting women from elite universities, Vassar, Smith, Wellesley, who could blend seamlessly into diplomatic and academic circles. These women were often told they were helping their country in special ways without being given the full weight of what their work entailed. The psychological preparation was minimal by later standards. One former CIA officer recalled her 1,960 seconds training. "They taught us how to lose a tail, how to make a dead drop, how to lie convincingly. What they didn't teach us was how to live with the lying, how to manage the cognitive dissonance of betraying everyone who trusted you while believing you were serving a higher purpose." The Stasi refined recruitment to a science. In East Germany, the Ministry for State Security identified potential female agents as early as high school, watching for intelligence, ideological commitment, and what one training manual called adaptive social skills. Gabriele Gast was approached while studying at university, flattered by attention from sophisticated older men who turned out to be Stasi recruiters. The approach was methodical. First, assess ideological sympathies. Second, cultivate through seemingly innocent intellectual discussions. Third, request small favors that gradually escalated into full espionage. The Stasi employed approximately 91,000 full-time workers and 189,000 informants by 1989, many of them women who reported on colleagues, neighbors, even family members. The psychological weight of this surveillance state was immense. Every conversation was potentially monitored, every relationship potentially compromised. The double life extracted a profound psychological toll. Ruth Werner, operating in Britain under the code name Sonia, managed to maintain a cover as a suburban housewife while running a sophisticated spy network that included Klaus Fuchs, the physicist who passed atomic secrets to Moscow. She described in her heavily censored memoir the constant hypervigilance, checking for surveillance, memorizing faces, planning escape routes, even during routine shopping trips. "I had to be two people at all times, the mother who packed school lunches and attended parent meetings, and the intelligence officer who could encrypt messages and arrange dead drops without missing a beat," she wrote. The strain of this division manifested in insomnia, anxiety, and what she called the feeling of being watched, even when alone. Modern psychologists recognize this as hypervigilance, a symptom of sustained traumatic stress, but in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, operatives were simply expected to endure. Ethel Rosenberg's case illustrated how the double life could metaplate into tragedy. Born Ethel Greenglass in 1915 to a poor Jewish family on New York's Lower East Side, she was drawn to communist ideals as a young woman during the Depression. She married Julius Rosenberg in 1939, and by most accounts, her involvement in his spy ring was peripheral. She may have typed notes, she certainly knew of his activities, but her role was likely minor compared to her husband's and her brother David Greenglass's direct theft of atomic secrets from Los Alamos. Yet when the FBI arrested the Rosenbergs in 1950, the investigation fixated on Ethel as a lever to break Julius. The assumption was that threatening a mother with execution would make her husband confess. FBI memos revealed deliberate strategy. Proceeding against his wife might serve as a lever in this matter. The strategy failed catastrophically. Both Rosenbergs maintained their innocence, and both went to the electric chair on the 19th of June, 1953. Ethel's final letter to her sons, written hours before her execution, revealed the psychological compartmentalization required of female operatives. "We were comforted in the sure knowledge that others would carry on after us." She never admitted her involvement, never broke character, even facing death. The discovery and capture process often began with seemingly minor anomalies. When MI5 began investigating the Portland spy ring in 1960, the initial lead came from a Polish defector who mentioned a couple passing secrets from the Portland naval base. Surveillance on Harry Houghton, a clerk, revealed regular meetings with a middle-aged couple, Morris and Lona Cohen, posing as antiquarian book dealers named Peter and Helen Kroger. The Cohens had been operating in Britain since 1954, having fled the United States when the Rosenberg network unraveled. MI5 watchers documented their movements for months: brush contacts in public parks, dead drops in movie theater restrooms, radio transmissions from their suburban bungalow. The surveillance was painstaking, photographing everyone they met, tracking their purchases, analyzing their cover story for inconsistencies. When officers finally raided their home in January 1961, they found a sophisticated communications setup hidden beneath the kitchen floor: a radio transmitter, one-time pads for encryption, and microfilm of classified documents. Lona had been carrying secrets in hollowed-out containers, in the linings of her handbag, even in her undergarments. Her training had been thorough, but decades of operational security had created habits that, once noticed, became patterns. The intensification of surveillance as suspicion grew created its own psychological warfare. When the KGB suspected that one of their operatives might be compromised, they would increase monitoring not to protect the agent, but to assess whether she had been turned. Female operatives reported the peculiar horror of being watched by both sides simultaneously: Western counterintelligence looking for proof of espionage, Soviet handlers looking for proof of betrayal. Hede Massing described this period before her defection in 1947. "I felt eyes everywhere. At the grocery store, I wondered if the woman behind me was FBI. At my apartment, I wondered if my handler had placed listening devices to catch me in disloyalty. I trusted no one, which meant I had no one." This total isolation was not an unfortunate side effect, but a deliberate feature of intelligence work. Isolated agents were dependent agents, less likely to defect or compromise operations. The moment of capture often came with shocking violence, particularly for women, whose perceived harmlessness made their resistance unexpected and their capture more brutal. When Elizabeth Bentley walked into the FBI's New York office in November 1945, she did so voluntarily, but her decision to defect came after months of paranoia. She believed the KGB planned to kill her because she knew too much and had become unreliable after her handler's death. Her debriefing lasted months, and she provided names of over 80 Soviet agents operating in the United States. The information devastated Soviet intelligence networks in America, but destroyed Bentley's life. She became a public spectacle, testifying before Congress, her credibility attacked by those she had named and by skeptics who couldn't believe a woman could have operated at such a high level. The FBI, having used her information, largely abandoned her to public scrutiny and media sensationalism. In the Eastern Bloc, capture meant something far more terrifying. When the Stasi arrested suspected spies, they employed a technique called Zersetzung decomposition, designed to psychologically destroy the target without physical torture that would create martyrs. Women suspected of espionage might find their children suddenly denied school admission, their apartments broken into with small items moved but nothing stolen, their friends and colleagues turned into informants who fed back manipulated information. One woman arrested for attempting to pass information to the West described her interrogation. "They didn't beat me. They didn't need to. They brought in my daughter's teacher, my neighbor, my sister, all people I trusted, and each one testified against me. They had been reporting on me for years. Everyone I loved had betrayed me, or so I was made to believe. I would have preferred physical torture." The psychological preparation that agencies provided proved woefully inadequate for these realities. Training focused on practical tradecraft dead drops, brush passes, coded communications, but rarely addressed the existential weight of sustained deception. One CIA training manual from the 1950 seconds devoted 30 pages to surveillance detection and half a page to maintaining emotional equilibrium under cover. Female operatives were expected to manage not just the operational challenges, but the social ones, maintaining marriages while lying to husbands, raising children while hiding their true work. performing feminine domesticity while engaging in activities that contradicted every social expectation of women in that era. Virginia Hall, the OSS operative who had lost her leg in a hunting accident before the war, faced additional challenges. Her prosthetic, which she nicknamed Cuthbert, caused chronic pain but also became part of her legend. When the Gestapo circulated wanted posters describing her distinctive limp, she learned to walk differently, to disguise the very disability that defined her. The physical pain was constant, but she later said the psychological effort of constantly performing normalcy while managing operations was far more exhausting. The spy game became lethal not just through execution or imprisonment, but through the slower death of the self. Markus Wolf, the legendary head of East German foreign intelligence, later reflected on his use of Romeo agents, men who seduced lonely secretaries in West German government offices to gain access to secrets. But the women who were seduced and recruited faced a particular horror. Their very capacity for love and trust had been weaponized against them and their country. When these networks were eventually uncovered, as with the Guillaume affair in 1974 that brought down Chancellor Willy Brandt, the women involved faced not just legal consequences, but public humiliation. They had been doubly betrayed by the men who had pretended to love them and by the societies that blamed them for being vulnerable to manipulation. The Lubyanka building sits in the heart of Moscow like a poisoned tooth, its yellow brick facade deceiving in its ordinariness. For decades, Muscovites would avert their eyes when passing Dzerzhinsky Square, afraid that even looking at KGB headquarters might draw unwanted attention. Inside, beneath the administrative offices, where bureaucrats shuffled papers and typed reports, lay a warren of interrogation rooms and cells where the machinery of psychological destruction operated with industrial efficiency. When Edith Sushitsky, an Austrian-born British subject suspected of espionage, was brought to Lubyanka in 1969 after being arrested in Moscow, she descended into what prisoners called the basement, a network of corridors painted institutional green, lit by bare bulbs that never dimmed, where the architecture itself was designed to disorient. Cell doors had no handles on the inside. Guards moved silently in felt-soled boots. Meals arrived at irregular intervals to destroy any sense of time. This was not random cruelty but calculated methodology, refined over decades and documented in training manuals that treated human psychology as a technical problem to be solved. The breaking of a spy, particularly a female spy whose very existence challenged assumptions about feminine weakness, required not just information extraction, but the complete dismantling of identity, resistance, and hope. The anatomy of Cold War spy prisons revealed each side's philosophy of control and punishment. Lubyanka, built in the late 19th century as the headquarters of the All-Russia Insurance Company before being seized by the Cheka in 1918, contained approximately 110 cells by the Cold War era, ranging from solitary confinement boxes barely large enough to stand in to larger rooms holding multiple prisoners. The interrogation rooms on the third floor were soundproofed, furnished with a simple desk, 2 chairs, and a spotlight that could be angled to blind the subject while leaving the interrogator in shadow. Former prisoners described the smell a mixture of fear sweat, disinfectant, and something metallic that might have been blood or might have been the building's ancient plumbing. The guards at Lubyanka were trained to be impersonal, never speaking unnecessarily, creating an atmosphere of bureaucratic inevitability. One instruction manual for guards specified that prisoners should be addressed only by case number, never by name, to reinforce their dehumanization. When Ruth Fischer, a German communist who had fallen afoul of Stalin's purges and later worked with American intelligence, was interrogated at Lubyanka in the 1,950 seconds during a visit to Moscow, she later described the psychological impact of the building itself. The walls seemed to absorb sound and hope equally. You felt that thousands had suffered in those rooms before you, and that your suffering was just another file in an endless archive of misery. East Berlin's Stasi prisons operated under different principles, but with equal sophistication. Hohenschönhausen Prison, opened in 1,951 inches, a northeastern district of East Berlin, became the central remand center for political prisoners and captured spies. Unlike Lubyanka's retrofitted Tsarist building, Hohenschönhausen was purpose-built for psychological torture. The original basement cells, used until 1960, were referred to as the submarine because they were windowless, damp, and lit only by dim bulbs, creating a sense of being underwater, cut off from the world. Later, a new wing constructed in 1961 featured modern interrogation techniques. Cells painted in colors psychologists had determined would maximize anxiety, rubber-lined walls that made hanging oneself impossible, and heating systems that could be adjusted to make cells unbearably hot or freezing cold. The interrogation rooms, called friendly rooms, in Stasi documents with Orwellian irony, contained comfortable chairs for interrogators and backless stools for prisoners, forcing the subject to maintain an uncomfortable posture during sessions that could last 8 to 12 hours. Vera Lengsfeld, a dissident arrested in 1988, later testified about her Hohenschönhausen interrogation. "They didn't need to beat you." The building itself was the torture device. The silence, the isolation, the absolute control of every aspect of your existence, these broke people more effectively than any physical violence. The Stasi trained interrogators at a special school in Potsdam-Eich, where courses in operative psychology taught methods of exploiting fear, guilt, and family bonds. One declassified training document from 1975 stated, "The female subject presents unique opportunities for psychological leverage, particularly regarding children and social reputation." The Western powers operated their own network of secret detention facilities, though these were officially denied until decades later. During the early Cold War, the CIA maintained black sites in occupied Germany, including facilities in Frankfurt and Berlin, where Soviet defectors were debriefed and suspected double agents were interrogated. The most notorious was a facility in the American sector of Berlin, codenamed Ashcan, where the CIA interrogated individuals caught crossing between zones. While CIA doctrine officially prohibited torture, a 1963 interrogation manual titled Kubak Counterintelligence Interrogation emphasized psychological techniques over physical coercion. The reality was more complex. The manual detailed methods of sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and isolation that constituted torture by any reasonable definition, even if they left no physical marks. It noted that women are perhaps more responsive to the fear-up approach, particularly when it involves threats to family members, revealing the gendered assumptions that shaped interrogation strategy. In Britain, MI5 and MI6 utilized facilities including a converted mansion in Hampshire called Camp 020, originally used to interrogate German spies during World War II and repurposed during the Cold War for debriefing defectors and questioning suspected penetration agents. The camp's commandant during the war years, Lieutenant Colonel Robin Stevens, had written extensively about interrogation techniques, arguing that physical torture was counterproductive because it produced unreliable confessions, but that psychological pressure was both effective and deniable. The methods of psychological manipulation deployed before any physical coercion followed patterns that interrogators discovered through trial and error and later refined through systematic study. Sensory deprivation was among the most effective and widely used techniques across all intelligence services. When Lona Cohen was held in British custody after her 1961 arrest, interrogators initially placed her in solitary confinement at Holloway Prison in a cell with padding on the walls, constant dim lighting that made distinguishing day from night impossible, and no human contact except for brief interrogation sessions. The goal was to create a desperate hunger for human interaction that interrogators could then exploit. Soviet psychologists working for the KGB had documented that approximately 48 hours of complete isolation was sufficient to make most subjects significantly more compliant and suggestible. The technique was refined at Lubyanka and other facilities. Prisoners were kept in cells with lights that never turned off, creating sleep deprivation. Meals arrived at irregular intervals, destroying circadian rhythms. Guards communicated only through gestures and knocks, creating a world without language. Former prisoner Susanne Albrecht, a West German terrorist who worked with the Stasi and was eventually arrested, described her interrogation in East Berlin. After 3 days of isolation, I would have talked to anyone about anything. The interrogator who finally came seemed like a savior, someone breaking the terrible silence. Only later did I realize this was exactly the response they had engineered. Fake executions represented another psychological weapon that exploited the fundamental human fear of death. In Soviet facilities, prisoners might be awakened in the middle of the night, told they were being taken for execution, marched through corridors to what sounded like gunshots in the distance, then returned to their cells. The message was clear. We can kill you at any moment. Your life continues only at our whim. Heda Masing, during her own interrogation by Soviet intelligence before she defected, described such an incident. They took me from my cell at what I thought was dawn, though time had lost meaning. They read what sounded like a death sentence in Russian, which I understood only partially. They walked me down a corridor to a room where there was a drain in the floor. I was certain I would be shot and hosed down the drain. Then they laughed and took me back. I was shaking so violently I couldn't stand. The Stasi employed similar techniques, but with characteristic Germanic precision, documenting in internal reports the psychological impact of what they called Zermürbung, wearing down. One report from 1976 noted that the threat of execution, when combined with isolation and sleep deprivation, produces confession within an average of 7 days for female subjects, compared to 2 days for male subjects, suggesting greater effectiveness of fear-based approaches with women. Forced confessions were the ultimate goal of most interrogations, whether the confession was true or fabricated. The techniques for extracting confessions had been refined through decades of practice across multiple intelligence services. Soviet interrogators at Lubyanka employed what they called the conveyor belt, continuous interrogation in shifts, where fresh interrogators rotated in every few hours while the prisoner remained, becoming progressively more exhausted, confused, and desperate. Elena Bonner, Andrei Sakharov's wife, and a human rights activist who was interrogated by the KGB in the 1980 seconds, described the technique. They asked the same questions over and over, sometimes kindly, sometimes screaming, sometimes with elaborate patience as though explaining to a child. After 20 hours, you begin to doubt your own memory. After 30, you'll sign anything to make it stop. The interrogators would present documents for signature, sometimes confessions to crimes the prisoner hadn't committed, sometimes denunciations of colleagues or family members. Refusal meant the process would begin again. The Stasi added technological sophistication, recording confessions on video that could be edited and used for propaganda purposes. Gabriele Gast, after her arrest, was interrogated for months until she provided a confession that detailed her espionage activities. The confession was then refined through multiple drafts until it served the investigators' narrative purposes, with Gast later noting, "By the end, I was confessing to things I hadn't done and forgetting things I had done. The confession they wanted became the truth in my mind." Gender-specific tortures revealed the cruel precision with which interrogators exploited the particular vulnerabilities and social positions of female prisoners. For women with children, the threat implied or explicit of harm to their offspring was devastatingly effective. When Ethel Rosenberg was held at the Women's House of Detention in New York City before and during her trial, FBI agents repeatedly suggested that cooperation would allow her to return to her sons, Michael and Robert, then 6 and 10 years old. The boys were sent to stay with family members who themselves were under investigation, creating a situation where Ethel knew her children were suffering but was powerless to help them. Her attorney, Emanuel Bloch, later wrote that the cruelest torture inflicted on Ethel was not the threat of death, but the knowledge that her children were being traumatized by her imprisonment. In Soviet facilities, mothers who were prisoners might be told their children had been sent to orphanages or even that they had died, a lie designed to destroy hope and resistance. One former Gulag prisoner, Evgenia Ginsburg, described in her memoir Journey into the Whirlwind how NKVD interrogators told her that her children had denounced her as an enemy of the people, a fabrication designed to break her psychologically. The Stasi maintained detailed files on prisoners' families and would use children as leverage with clinical precision. In one documented case from 1982, a woman suspected of planning to defect to the West was shown photographs of her daughter at school, at play, walking home, the message clear that the child was under surveillance and vulnerable. Intimate humiliation and the threat of gender-based coercion was employed across intelligence services, though with varying degrees of official sanction. In Soviet prisons, while assault was not official policy, the threat was omnipresent and sometimes carried out by criminal prisoners who were given access to political prisoners as a form of punishment. Strip searches were conducted with deliberate humiliation, with male guards sometimes present. In Stasi facilities, female prisoners reported being forced to undress during interrogations, ostensibly for searches, but clearly intended to increase vulnerability and shame. One woman interrogated at Hohenschönhausen in 1985 testified, "They made me stand without proper clothing while they asked questions about my contacts in West Berlin. The interrogator never touched me, but he made it clear he could, at any time." The powerlessness was absolute. The exploitation of pregnancy was particularly cruel. Pregnant prisoners might be denied medical care, told their babies would be taken away at birth, or subjected to conditions designed to induce miscarriage. The CIA's Kubak manual, while not explicitly endorsing gender-based coercion, noted that threats to feminine dignity could be effective in breaking resistance, a euphemism that gave interrogators wide latitude in what they might employ. The comparison between Soviet, Western, and Eastern Bloc techniques revealed more similarities than differences, despite each side's ideological posturing. The Soviets justified their methods as defending the socialist state against capitalist aggression and internal counter-revolution. KGB training materials from the 1962, declassified after the Soviet collapse, explained that enemies of the people forfeit the rights of Soviet citizenship and must be treated as hostile combatants in the class struggle. This ideological framework allowed interrogators to employ brutal methods while maintaining that they were serving historical progress. The East Germans, perhaps because they were operating in a divided nation where their legitimacy was constantly questioned, developed the most sophisticated psychological techniques. Stasi Minister Erich Mielke wrote in a 1982 directive that the socialist state's security apparatus must be more humane than capitalist systems, employing scientific methods rather than crude violence. This scientific approach meant extensive psychological profiling, manipulation of family bonds, and the Zersetzung techniques designed to destroy individuals without leaving evidence. The irony was that these humane methods were often more psychologically damaging than physical torture, creating trauma that lasted decades. Western intelligence services justified their interrogation methods through a different lens, but with similar results. The CIA's approach, codified in documents like the Kubak manual, emphasized that psychological techniques were more effective than physical torture and had the advantage of being deniable. The manual stated, "Interrogation is essentially a controlled psychological environment designed to destroy the subject's capacity for resistance while maintaining a facade of legality." This allowed interrogators to employ isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and psychological pressure while technically adhering to prohibitions against torture. British intelligence operated under even stricter legal constraints, but MI5 and MI6 developed methods of deep interrogation that pushed the boundaries of what was permissible. When interrogating Soviet defectors or suspected double agents, British services employed isolation, disorientation, and psychological pressure while maintaining that they were simply conducting intensive debriefing. The justification was always national security. These were traitors, spies, or enemy agents whose rights were subordinate to the state's need for information. As one CIA interrogator noted in a declassified memo from 1964, "In the contest between individual dignity and national survival, we must choose survival." The propaganda factor transformed torture from an information-gathering tool into a weapon of political warfare. Show trials of captured spies served multiple purposes beyond the immediate case. In the Soviet Union, the trials of Western spies were publicized to demonstrate Western perfidy and justify the security state's existence. When Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot shot down over Soviet territory in 1960, was tried in Moscow, the proceedings were filmed and broadcast to show the world how the aggressive American empire violated Soviet sovereignty. For female spies, the propaganda value was even greater because their trials could be used to demonstrate both Western depravity. Look how the imperialists exploit women and the superior morality of the socialist system that had caught and punished them. When Lorna Cohen was tried in Britain in 1961, the prosecution emphasized the betrayal of hospitality. She had lived in Britain under false identity, accepted British freedoms, and repaid this with espionage. The gendered language was explicit. She had violated the domestic sphere, turned the home into a nest of spies, betrayed the feminine role of nurturer. The Daily Mail described her as the deadly housewife, while the Telegraph called her a viper in suburban clothing, language that would never have been applied to male spies. In East Germany, the Stasi used captured Western agents in propaganda that was remarkably sophisticated. After extracting confessions, often through months of psychological pressure, the Stasi would produce documentary films featuring the prisoner, explaining their recruitment, training, and operations. These films were shown in schools, workplaces, and military units as warnings about Western intelligence operations. In one particularly cruel example from 1976, a West German woman named Renate Scherhaufer, arrested for attempting to help East Germans escape to the West, was forced to make a televised confession in which she denounced her own actions and praised the humanitarian treatment she had received from Stasi interrogators. The video showed her pale and thin, speaking in a flat monotone that suggested either drugging or complete psychological breakdown. Years later, after reunification, she testified that she had been kept in isolation for 6 months, told her family had abandoned her, and promised that cooperation would lead to release. The confession was a fabrication, but by the time she was psychologically broken enough to deliver it convincingly, she later said, "I almost believed it myself. They had rewritten my memory, my understanding of my own motivations." The Western powers similarly used captured spies for propaganda purposes, though they marketed it as justice rather than re-education. The Rosenberg trial in 1951 was covered extensively in American media, with the couple portrayed as alien infiltrators who had betrayed not just their country, but the very concept of American family values. Ethel Rosenberg was depicted as the ultimate transgressor, a mother who put ideology above her children, a wife who enabled her husband's treason, a Jew who had rejected American opportunity for Soviet communism. The anti-Semitic undertones were rarely explicit, but consistently present in coverage that emphasized the Rosenbergs' foreign nature, despite both being native-born Americans. Judge Irving Kaufman's sentencing statement made the propaganda purpose explicit. "I consider your crime worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows, but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason." This hyperbolic language, unsupported by actual strategic analysis, served to justify the death sentence and to send a message to potential spies about the consequences of betrayal. The execution itself, with its multiple electrical charges needed to kill Ethel, became a propaganda tool for both sides. American anti-communists cited it as proof of the state's resolve, while Soviet propagandists pointed to it as evidence of American barbarism, particularly the execution of a mother. The use of torture and interrogation as performance extended beyond public trials to private calculations. Intelligence services on both sides recognized that captured spies represented opportunities not just for information, but for psychological operations against the other side. When a spy was caught, the arresting service had to decide: prosecute publicly, use privately for counterintelligence, attempt to turn them into a double agent, or exchange them for captured agents of their own. Each option had propaganda implications. A public trial demonstrated vigilance and competence. A quiet exchange suggested pragmatic professionalism. A turned double agent represented the ultimate victory, not just neutralizing an enemy spy, but converting them into an asset. For female spies, the calculus was complicated by gender. A woman who could be publicly broken, who would tearfully confess and denounce her handlers, was worth more as propaganda than as an intelligence source. The Stasi excelled at this calculation, maintaining detailed cost-benefit analyses of prisoners that weighed intelligence value against propaganda impact against potential exchange value. On a grey afternoon in 1986, a woman named Ruth Werner sat in her East German apartment, staring at the manuscript she had been asked to approve for publication. The pages told her own story: decades of espionage for Soviet intelligence, operations across 3 continents, lovers sacrificed for the cause, and secrets that had helped shift the balance of nuclear power. Yet, as she read, she realized how much had been sanitized, rewritten, made palatable for the state that had used her. The parts about the fear, the interrogations by both sides when suspicion fell on her, the years of looking over her shoulder, those were footnotes, if they appeared at all. Werner's experience encapsulated a bitter truth that countless female operatives would discover. Surviving the Cold War's shadow games was only the beginning of a longer, quieter ordeal. The women who emerged from interrogation cells, labor camps, and years of duplicity found themselves navigating a world that had no place for them. Virginia Hall, the American OSS operative who had been hunted by the Gestapo and later worked for the CIA, received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1945, but in a closed ceremony, with no publicity, no photographs. When she tried to continue meaningful intelligence work after the war, she found herself relegated to desk work, her wooden leg and gender cited as liabilities. She retired in 1966, her contributions largely unknown to the public until decades after her death. The very qualities that made female spies effective, their ability to disappear, to blend, to become invisible, became their curse in peacetime. They had been trained to erase themselves, and their governments were happy to let them stay erased. The psychological aftermath proved even more devastating than the physical scars. Heda Massing, who spied for Soviet intelligence in the 1,930 seconds and 40 seconds before defecting, spent her later years in profound psychological distress. In her memoir, This Deception, published in 1951, she wrote about the peculiar trauma of living multiple lies, lying to her husbands, her friends, her adopted country, and eventually to herself. "I had become so many people that I no longer knew which one was real," she confessed. Modern psychologists would recognize her symptoms as complex PTSD, but in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, female operatives who showed signs of mental breakdown were often dismissed as hysterical or emotionally weak, their suffering attributed to feminine fragility rather than the brutal reality of their experiences. For those captured and tortured, reintegration was nearly impossible. Lona Cohen, arrested in 1961 as part of the Portland spy ring, spent 20 years in British prisons before being exchanged in 1969. When she returned to Moscow, she discovered that the Soviet Union she had sacrificed everything for had changed beyond recognition, and the KGB regarded her with suspicion had she been turned during her imprisonment. Had she given up secrets? She and her husband Morris lived in a kind of gilded exile, given state honors but kept at arm's length, always watched. Lona rarely spoke about her prison years, but those who knew her noticed how she would sometimes stop mid-sentence, her eyes distant, her hands trembling. The interrogation room never fully releases its victims. The media's treatment of these women reflected society's profound ambivalence about female agency, intimacy, and patriotism. When Ethel Rosenberg was executed in 1953, newspapers portrayed her as a monstrous mother who loved communism more than her children, the ultimate betrayal of feminine domesticity. The fact that evidence against her was thin mattered less than the narrative of the treacherous woman. Conversely, when Mata Hari was executed in 1917, she became the archetype of the seductress spy, her supposed betrayals inseparable from her perceived desirability. This pattern repeated throughout the Cold War. Women who spied were either viewed as improper or unnaturally cold, either too feminine or not feminine enough, but never simply competent professionals making calculated choices. Some women fought this erasure. Melita Norwood, exposed in 1999 at age 87 as having passed British atomic secrets to Moscow for decades, gave a defiant press conference in her garden. Wearing a cardigan and leaning on her walker, she declared, "I did what I did not to make money, but to help prevent the defeat of a new system which had, at great cost, given ordinary people food and fares which they could afford." The British tabloids dubbed her the Granny Spy, unable to reconcile her conventional appearance with her decades of betrayal. The diminutive nickname itself was a kind of erasure, making her quaint, almost cute, rather than acknowledging her as a serious ideological actor who had altered history. Eastern Bloc nations created a different kind of silence. Women who had been interrogated by the Stasi or KGB, even if they were eventually released or deemed loyal, lived under permanent suspicion. Their files remained open, their children were denied university admissions, their careers were limited. Gabriele Gast, who spied for the Stasi while working in West German intelligence, served time after reunification and then tried to rebuild her life. She gave occasional interviews, attempting to explain her motivations, but found that people wanted her to fit a simple narrative, naive idealist or callous traitor. The complexity of her experience, the ways she had been both victim and perpetrator, manipulated and manipulator, couldn't fit into the sound bites that post-Cold War Germany demanded. Perhaps the cruelest legacy was the loneliness. Female operatives often couldn't share their experiences with family members who had never known what they really did. Marriages collapsed under the weight of decades of lies. Children grew up with mothers they never really knew. Jonna Mendez, a former CIA officer and chief of disguise, later described how her daughter once asked why mommy was always going away, and she had to lie, creating a false career, a false life. Even after retirement, even after the secrets were declassified, the habit of silence remained. These women had learned too well that trust was a weapon that could be used against them. The therapeutic language we now have for trauma complex PTSD, moral injury, dissociative identity didn't exist for these women in their prime. They suffered without vocabulary, without support groups, without the recognition that what they experienced was a deep trauma that deserved acknowledgement and healing. Some self-medicated with alcohol. Some threw themselves into new causes, seeking redemption or simply distraction. Some simply disappeared into suburbs and silence, becoming the grey-haired women at the grocery store whose eyes sometimes went distant when sirens sounded or doors slammed too hard. History has been slow to honor them, even slower to grieve for them. The monuments to Cold War espionage typically feature men Kim Philby, Oleg Gordievsky, Aldrich Ames. The women remain footnotes, their stories emerging in fragments, often only after death when archives open and family members speak. We are left with incomplete pictures, redacted files, and the haunting awareness that countless women endured interrogations, torture, and decades of psychological warfare without ever having their names recorded or their sacrifices acknowledged. And so, behind the iron curtains and whispered codes, we uncover not just secrets, but suffering. Women like Ursula Kuczynski, Ethel Rosenberg, and countless unnamed agents carried the weight of their nations, surviving interrogations that blurred the line between duty and despair. Their courage was not always rewarded, nor their stories fully told. As the Cold War's frost melts into history, we are left to question, what does loyalty cost when truth itself becomes a weapon? In the haunting words of George Orwell, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, you've seen the shadows behind the espionage. Until next time, stay curious,